What really happens when the world decides it already knows your story before you've ever had a chance to tell it yourself? Because for Meg Ryan, that question wasn't theoretical. It became her life. For more than a decade, she wasn't just an actress. She was a cultural symbol, Hollywood's golden smile, the face of romance, the woman who made millions believe in love again. But behind that carefully constructed image was a life moving in a very different direction, one shaped by pressure, fame, private fractures, and eventually a scandal that would follow her for decades. And at the center of it all was a story the world thought it understood. But what if it didn't? What if everything we believed about Meg Ryan and Russell Crowe was only half the truth? What if the real story is far more complicated and far more human than the headlines ever admitted? To understand that, we have to go back before the scandal, before the breakup, before the tabloids turned it into mythology. We have to go back to the rise of Meg Ryan. There was a time when Meg Ryan wasn't just popular, she was unstoppable. In the 1990s, she didn't simply appear in romantic comedies. She defined them. She was the actress audiences trusted without hesitation. If her name was on a film poster, people didn't ask what it was about. They already knew. It would be warm, emotional, funny, and unforgettable. She became the face of an entire genre. But that level of fame doesn't appear overnight. It builds slowly through years of ambition, risk, and timing that can't be manufactured. Born Margaret Hyra in Fairfield, Connecticut, she grew up in a household shaped by education and structure. Her mother had acting experience, her father was a teacher, and nothing in her early life guaranteed Hollywood success. But something in her clearly wanted more than a predictable path. She studied first at the University of Connecticut, then transferred to New York University. And just one semester before graduating, she made a decision that would change everything. She left college to pursue acting full-time. It was a gamble most people wouldn't take, and most who do never recover from it. But Meg Ryan wasn't most people. Her early acting work began in television, most notably in soap operas, where she learned something that can't be taught in classrooms: consistency under pressure. Long shooting schedules, emotional repetition, and constant performance built her foundation as an actress. But television wasn't her destination. Hollywood was, and Hollywood first truly noticed her in a small role in Top Gun. It wasn't a leading role. It wasn't a dramatic showcase. But sometimes visibility is enough. Sometimes being in the right film at the right time changes everything. And Top Gun changed everything. Because after that, Meg Ryan was no longer unknown. She was on the radar. If Top Gun introduced her, then When Harry Met Sally immortalized her. Released in 1989, the film became more than a romantic comedy. It became a cultural reference point, a movie people quoted, rewatched, and emotionally attached themselves to. And at its center was Meg Ryan as Sally Albright, a character intelligent, funny, skeptical about love, but still deeply human in her desire for connection. It was the kind of role that doesn't just entertain an audience, it stays with them. And then came the scene, the one everyone remembers, the moment that turned Meg Ryan into a household name almost overnight. From that point forward, she wasn't just acting in romantic comedies. She was romantic comedy. The 1990s belonged to her. Film after film followed. Sleepless in Seattle, French Kiss, You've Got Mail. Each one reinforced the same idea. Meg Ryan wasn't just successful, she was dependable in a way Hollywood rarely allows. Audiences trusted her. Studios depended on her. And her box office numbers reflected it. Hundreds of millions of dollars in global revenue built her reputation as one of the most valuable actresses in the world. At her peak, she could command salaries that rivaled the biggest male stars in Hollywood. At one point, she earned $15 million for a single film, an extraordinary figure for any actor at the time. But success has a strange double edge. Because the higher you rise in public life, the less private your real life becomes. And behind the image of the perfect romantic lead, things were not as perfect as they seemed. Before Russell Crowe entered the story, there was Dennis Quaid. He was not a background figure. He was a successful actor in his own right, known for roles in major films and respected within the industry. When they met, he was arguably the more established star. Their relationship began like many Hollywood romances, on set, with chemistry that blurred the line between performance and reality. They worked together, reconnected later, and eventually began dating seriously. But fame has a way of shifting balance inside relationships, and over time, something changed. As Meg Ryan's career skyrocketed, Dennis Quaid's presence in the public didn't grow at the same pace. And that imbalance created something neither love nor success can easily solve: emotional displacement. At one point, Quaid would later reflect on how it felt to be beside her in public, that people recognized her instantly, called her name, and often didn't notice him at all. It wasn't jealousy in a dramatic sense. It was something quieter, a fading sense of identity. Still, they built a life together. They married in 1991, and soon after, they had a son, Jack Quaid, who would eventually grow up to follow both of his parents into acting. But behind the scenes, the marriage was already under strain. Quaid struggled with personal challenges, including substance issues in his past that he openly discussed later. He entered rehab before their marriage got clean and worked to rebuild stability. But recovery doesn't erase emotional complexity, and fame doesn't pause for healing. The pressures kept building. Career differences widened. Emotional distance grew. And by the late 1990s, the relationship had already begun to fracture in ways the public could not see. By 2000, the separation was underway, and that's when everything shifted, because another presence entered the story, a presence that would change how the world saw Meg Ryan forever. Russell Crowe was not the typical Hollywood co-star. He wasn't polished in the traditional sense. He wasn't built around charm or carefully controlled public image. Instead, he was known for something far more volatile: intensity. He carried a reputation for being unpredictable, direct, and emotionally forceful in a way that often blurred the boundaries between personality and performance. And when he arrived on the set of Proof of Life, everything changed. The film itself was an action-driven drama about hostage negotiation, but behind the camera, something far more human was unfolding. Meg Ryan and Russell Crowe shared scenes that required emotional proximity. Their characters developed connection on screen. But according to people around the production, that connection didn't stop when filming did. It continued off camera. Subtle at first, then more visible, then impossible to ignore. By mid-2000, the rumors were no longer rumors. Photographs emerged. Public appearances were noticed. And suddenly, the narrative began forming without anyone needing to confirm it. Meg Ryan and Russell Crowe were together, but there was a problem, because at that exact moment, her marriage to Dennis Quaid was still in the process of ending. And in Hollywood, timing is everything. Not in reality, but in perception. And perception can become more powerful than truth. Once the story broke, it didn't matter how complex the situation was. Complexity doesn't survive headlines. Simplification does. And the simplified version of the story spread quickly. Meg Ryan left her husband for Russell Crowe. That version became the dominant narrative almost instantly. Tabloids framed it as betrayal. Talk shows amplified it. Public opinion solidified it. And suddenly, the woman who had once symbolized innocence, romance, and emotional sincerity was recast in a completely different role. Not the romantic lead, but the scandal, the homewrecker. The fall from grace wasn't gradual. It was immediate in tone, even if the reality behind it was more complicated. And within months, Meg Ryan's public image had shifted dramatically. But what was happening privately told a different story. According to her later reflections, the marriage with Dennis Quaid had already been deeply unstable before the relationship with Crowe became public. She would later describe it as a relationship that had effectively ended long before the paperwork did. But public narratives don't wait for clarification. They decide first, and ask questions later, if at all. Meg Ryan and Russell Crowe's relationship lasted less than a year. But its cultural impact lasted far longer. They were photographed together at events, seen in public places, and occasionally described by insiders as intensely connected. Some accounts suggested emotional immersion. Two people caught in a rapid, consuming connection formed under unusual circumstances. Others described imbalance. One partner more intense, more committed, more forward-moving than the other. Crowe, according to reports, expressed a desire for a long-term future. But Ryan, having just emerged from a collapsing marriage and years of intense public visibility, was navigating a different emotional reality. Distance also played a role. Their lives were split between continents, schedules, and careers that demanded constant attention. Eventually, the relationship ended quietly. No dramatic statements. No public confrontation. Just separation. But the story didn't end there. Because even though the relationship was over, the narrative surrounding it was just beginning. After the breakup, Meg Ryan found herself in a position many public figures eventually face, but few fully understand until it happens to them. She wasn't just criticized for a relationship, she was redefined by it. The public perception shift was severe. The actress once known for warmth and relatability became, in many headlines, a symbol of controversy. And in Hollywood, perception has consequences. Opportunities changed. Roles shifted. The industry, once fully aligned with her success, began to drift. And while she continued working, something fundamental had changed in how she was seen. But perhaps the most misunderstood part of this entire period is how she experienced it herself. Because while the world assumed collapse, she later described something very different. Not destruction, but release. The end of needing to be understood by everyone else. The end of trying to maintain an image built by others. Years later, another moment added complexity to her public image. An interview with Michael Parkinson became infamous. It was meant to promote her work, but quickly turned tense. Questions became sharp. Responses became short. The atmosphere became uncomfortable. And by the end, she appeared disengaged. The public reaction was immediate and unforgiving. She was labeled arrogant, cold, difficult. But time has a way of revisiting moments like this. Years later, even Parkinson acknowledged that the interview had not gone as it should have. He admitted he handled parts of it poorly and expressed regret. But by then, the damage to perception had already been done. And Meg Ryan had already begun stepping away from Hollywood. After a series of commercially and critically underperforming films, Meg Ryan stepped away from acting for an extended period. Not because she disappeared, but because she chose distance. Distance from expectation. Distance from narrative. Distance from constant interpretation of who she was supposed to be. During this time, speculation about her appearance, career decisions, and personal life only intensified. But she remained largely outside the conversation, choosing privacy over correction, silence over explanation. And in that silence, a different version of her life began forming. One not defined by scandal, but by autonomy. Years later, Meg Ryan returned to filmmaking, not as the central romantic figure Hollywood once built her into, but as a creator on her own terms. She co-wrote, directed, and acted in projects that reflected a more personal approach to storytelling. Not driven by box office expectations, but by personal expression. And while these projects did not recreate her earlier commercial dominance, they represented something more meaningful for her own narrative: control. Control over story. Control over identity. Control over direction. So, what really happened between Meg Ryan and Russell Crowe? The simplest answer is the one the world first accepted. But the reality is more layered. Yes, there was a relationship. Yes, it coincided with the end of her marriage. Yes, it became a public scandal. But, according to Ryan's later reflections, the emotional truth of that period was not betrayal in the way it was portrayed. It was transition. A complicated, messy human transition between two chapters of life. One ending long before the world acknowledged it, and another beginning under intense public scrutiny. Russell Crowe himself has spoken respectfully about her in later years, describing admiration and acknowledging the intensity of their connection. But like many Hollywood stories, what lasted longest wasn't the relationship itself. In the years that followed, both Meg Ryan and Russell Crowe moved forward in different directions.